Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Horus Heresy. Today we're going to be tackling Book 6, and this is kind of an interesting one, Book 6, Descent of Angels. Descent of Angels. This is arguably the first point at which the series starts to get problematic. I mean, it's inevitable in this kind of project that there are going to be installments that are more problematic than others because there are subjects that are more problematic than others. This is arguably the first of the books that looks at that focuses on an exclusively loyalist chapter, and given the legion that we're talking about, loyal comes in inverted commas here. Descent of Angels, as you may have guessed, is a look at the Dark Angels and how they're operating, both pre-heresy and sort of just as the heresy is beginning. What's really surprising about this book is that it's very closely focused on how the Dark Angels operate before the heresy. This is a significant chunk, I'd say about 2/3 of the book, deal with pre-heresy Caliban. And it's even before, not only before the conflict, but before the Emperor comes to Caliban. So what you get here are the Proto Dark Angels. What you have is an exploration of Caliban as a world and as a culture, and it's actually really fascinating, that element of it. It's fascinating in the sense that parts of this book you could fit them into an Age of Sigmar or Warhammer narrative, because the nature of Caliban itself. Caliban is a death world, and a death world in the Imperium is, or in the as the Imperium classifies it, is a world that is inimical to human life. And that's not to say that Caliban is inimical in terms of its environment. That's not the case. It's not like the air isn't unbreathable or anything like that. Most of the world is carpeted in forest. It's this huge forested, green, lush world. The problem is that the forests are extremely hostile. Extremely hostile to humanity. There are poisonous fungi, there are predatory monsters. I mean, real monsters. Some of the creatures that infest the woods in this book are like chimera. They're like mythological creatures rather than fantastical ones. There's even a subtle suggestion in this book. The way it describes the creatures, they might be offshoots of Tyranids. They might be like the earlier ancestors of the Tyranids that somehow became seeded on Caliban and are now just locked there. They don't have any connection to the wider hive fleets or anything like that, but now they've reverted to their instincts and are now just super predators. There's also a suggestion that the environment and the predators of Caliban are not necessarily natural. There is a suggestion that there is an influence of chaos, of the warp here. And that's what the book explores. But what's very interesting is the way humanity has created civilizations here. They are very sparse, and as you can imagine, there's no sort of worldwide communication. There's no worldwide network or anything like that. There are these little feudal pockets of civilization that live in fortresses and castles and temples, and they are very like feudal knightly orders. That's where the sort of Age of Sigmar thing comes from. They're sort of like these techno-barbarians. They do have forms of technology, but at this point, because the Imperium hasn't found them, it's not very advanced. It's not very advanced at all. It's sort of it's whatever's left over from the Dark Age of technology, essentially, which is ill-maintained, it's ill-understood. They do maintain it as best they can, but that's it. And it's really interesting. You actually do get a really detailed and intimate look at how these different temples and households and orders work, and how they work in relation to one another. You also get suggestions, and suggestions only, of where the imagery and the structure and the organization of the later Dark Angels Legion comes from, because they've clearly taken a great deal from their roots on Caliban from these knightly orders, hence the influence of knightly orders and knightly circles within the Dark Angels. The problem that the book faces is in the subject matter. The Dark Angels have always, not always, but certainly recently, are a legion that's defined by their mystery. They are defined by their secrecy, by the obliqueness of their agendas and their intentions and their true loyalties. So the book simultaneously attempts to delve into these things, but not too deeply. It can't do it too deeply because if it explains too much, then it undermines that essential mystery that lends the Dark Angels flavour and character and distinguishes them from, say, the Blood Angels or from the Ultramarines. It can't go too far and it can't do too much, and that's the problem the book faces. It does sometimes flounder. It does sometimes not quite it can't quite do what it clearly wants to do. It can't really go really deep into the circles of these knightly orders and what they truly believe, what they truly worship. So you get this kind of overview, you get this distant overview, and it's fascinating looking at the way these orders work, their politics, but also the way they work in relation to Lionel Johnson, who is, of course, he is this very mysterious figure, very like Mortarion in this book. There isn't a great deal of characterization with regards to Lionel Johnson. He is this distant kind of saintly being that is, he's seen through the perspective of the other characters. He's not a character in and of himself, really. He is interpreted and relayed to the reader through the perspectives of other protagonists, like Zahariel, who is a Dark Angel that's made up for this particular story. He's an aspirant of the Order, basically, and he's the narrator. He's the viewpoint of this book. So he is being inducted into the deeper secrets of the knightly orders, of sort of proto-imperial Caliban, as we are. He's kind of innocent in the same way that the reader is. So what's mysterious to us is also mysterious to him. And that kind of works. It does have good atmosphere. I will give it that. The problem is in terms of plot. The book doesn't seem to really know where it wants to go. It feels like half of a story, and much of what it's trying to tell is ambient. It relies on environmental storytelling a lot, which is fine. You know, it is kind of a world building story. It's trying to set up this culture, how it works, and how it changes as it is drawn into the Imperium, as the Emperor comes, as it becomes part of the wider empire, and the eyes of humanity on Caliban are open to the wider universe and the wider potential of rejoining humanity as a species. And that's interesting because you do get this schism that you get, initially it's ideological. It is not something that even feels like it's going to erupt into warfare or anything like that, but you do get it because, of course, you have Lionel Johnson and Luther. Luther is a very big character here because he was the leader of the biggest knightly order, the most influential knightly order on Caliban before Lionel Johnson turned up. And Luther's quite old. Luther's kind of an old guy at this point, very much like Corphaeron amongst the word bearers. So he's like Corphaeron in the sense that he doesn't become a full space marine. He can't, his organs can't take it. He becomes a kind of a pseudo space marine. He's given some enhancements and he is nominally a part of the Dark Angels, but only nominally. And that kind of eats at him, especially when Lionel Johnson leaves Caliban behind and leaves it in his care. He's not up to the task. That's the problem. He suffers the same thing that Horus does. He feels like he has been left behind. He feels like his world has been abandoned. And the fact that there are these schisms occurring, where there are rebellions happening, and he can't keep a lid on it, he can't contain it, is what eats at him, and it's what opens the way to the influence of chaos, essentially. It's quite interesting. It is quite interesting. It's a sedate book. All of the books before this, all of them have had loads going on. They've been really big, and you've had worlds being destroyed. You've had like warfare and genocide and grand betrayals and the destruction of entire fleets of vessels and ships. You don't get that here. You just don't get that. You do get a little bit of the latter stuff, because in the latter half of the book there is some stuff about what the Dark Angels do in the Great Crusade, just a little, but not a great deal, and that's where you get Zahariel becoming as a candidate for the Space Marines and being accepted as a neophyte, whereas characters like Luther aren't. And that's really fascinating, isn't it? It really is fascinating. But it's not really until the end, right near the end, that you really start to feel the influence of the schism that will eventually result in the Dark Angels being split right down the middle and becoming what they eventually become. It is interesting. I mean, the Dark Angels are my favourite loyalist chapter, so I love all of the monkish stuff. I love all of the knightly order symbolism. At this point, a lot of the monastic imagery hasn't been adopted by the Dark Angels. Some of it has, but not all of it. They are more knightly at this point. Their imagery is that of crusaders. It's Richard the Lionheart and that kind of thing. You know, they are knightly orders in the sense that they are very much like Christian crusading knights. They adopt that kind of imagery, and that's interesting. That is interesting, and it lends them a very different flavour than what they eventually become. But it's still not quite as, for example, it is nowhere near as in depth as Fulgrim was with regards to the Emperor's Children. It's nowhere near as in depth as the Flight of the Eisenstein was with regards to the Death Guard. The writer is struggling to balance the essential mystery of the Dark Angels and yet aren't providing suggestions of answers. It's a difficult tightrope to walk, and it's semi-successful. I'd say it's semi-successful. It's not a bad book by any degree. It's well written. It's just that it does flounder a little bit, and it is maybe a little bit stretched out. It feels a little bit overlong. Even so, it's interesting to read how the Loyalist chapters are faring in this series. And it's interesting because it does set out the pattern for the Loyalist chapters. It does seem to be the case, I know it's subjective, but it does seem to be the case that the books that deal with the Loyalist chapters are way more problematic than the ones that deal with the Traitor Legions. Fascinating stuff. When we come back, we'll be looking at book 7, which is Legion. Now, that's one of the most interesting of the books. Until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!